All right, Matthew 7. Matthew chapter 7 is where we're going to be, and we're going to be in verses 15 to 23. Matthew 7, 15 to verse 23. Let me read the passage for you this morning. Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not produce good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire, so you'll recognize them by their fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do miracles in your name? And then I will announce to you, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. Over the entire course of this year, we have been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we're now at the last two sections of this incredible teaching of Jesus, the most famous sermon that's ever been preached. And we've been working through it slowly, section by section. And here at the end, Jesus isn't giving us new teaching or new content. He's really just drilling it, driving it home, and calling us to say, hey, I've taught you a lot. Now apply it to your life. I don't want you to just know about this stuff. I want you to live this out. And his main point that we're going to hear again this week and next week is that he's not interested in us praising his message. He's not interested in us saying, man, that was a really good teaching. He's not interested in us just contemplating it, but he wants us to actually carry this out. And this is his exhortation to us as he closes, that live out what I've taught you. Live out what I've taught you. A few weeks ago, we've heard from Sean as we looked at the passage right before this, and Jesus describes two roads and two gates. He says one of those roads is wide, it's crowded, it's easy. But he says that road leads to destruction. And then the other road, he says it's narrow, it's costly, and it's hard. But if you choose to enter into that, it actually leads to life. And in today's passage, Jesus takes that imagery and he actually intensifies it. He says, not only must you choose the right road, but you must also be alert about who will guide you on that road. Because not everyone that looks like a shepherd is a shepherd. Not everyone that uses his name actually belongs to Jesus. And this is where the text we're studying today begins. It begins with a warning, watch out for false prophets. And here's the thing, it's not a warning against atheists or skeptics or people who hate Christianity. It's actually a warning against religious voices, spiritual guides, even miracle workers who look like they're pointing people to Jesus, but their lives tell a completely different story. And Jesus says they're like wolves dressed like sheep's clothing. They blend in, they sound right, but their fruit reveals the truth about them. A couple weeks ago, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio for work, and when I got there, before I got there, I found out that the Phillies were playing the Reds, and I'm a huge baseball fan, a huge Phillies fan. Sorry, Rangers fan right there, but so I was like, hey, I've got time. I'm going to go, and I'm going to watch the game. And so the Phillies won, praise the Lord, and at the game ended, I took an Uber to go back from the stadium to my hotel. And so I asked the people that were working there, where's the best place to get an Uber? And the lady was like, across the street, there's a line of cars. They're all Uber drivers, taxi drivers. And if you get there and go into one of those cars, they will get you safely to your home. And it seems straightforward enough. And so I walked to the first car in line. And I get into the first car. And before I could even give him my address, the guy just starts taking off. That should have been my first red flag. And then I told him where I needed to go, and instead of punching it into an app and asking for a meter, or starting a meter, he just throws out a flat price. No dashboard, no Uber or Lyft sticker, nothing that looks official, just his word. Then I asked, do you take a credit card? Or do you take an app? And he goes, nope, cash only. And I'm telling him, I don't have any cash. And he goes, that's okay. We'll stop at an ATM. And at that point, I realized this was not an Uber driver. This was not a licensed taxi driver. This was a guy pretending to be what he wasn't, taking advantage of the chaos of the crowd and the convenience of the line. Now, thankfully, everything turned out okay. I'm still alive and I'm here. He did get me home safely. I grabbed some money from an ATM and gave it to him. And so in one sense, everything worked out. But here's the reality. He was a counterfeit. He looked the part. He was in the right place. He sounded legit, but he was an imposter. He wasn't who he appeared to be. And sometimes I honestly wonder if Jesus lets me experience crazy stuff like that just so I can have a sermon illustration for you. And so the suffering that I experience for your good, right? But this is the exact kind of situation that Jesus is warning us about in Matthew chapter 7. He says there's false guides who look real, sound real, they're in the right line, but in reality they are wolves in sheep's clothing. And here's the thing, it was impossible to know the difference between the real driver and the imposter that day. They looked the same. Their cars were very similar. They were in the line and the guy was hanging out with other drivers on the side before I walked in. And so how in the world are you supposed to know who you could actually trust to get you where you need to go? And in many ways, that's the exact question that our text is addressing this morning. How do you discern false teachers from the ones that will actually lead you toward Jesus? This passage, when you first glance, it almost feels a little scattered. It feels like Jesus is jumping all over the place. There's this talk about false prophets, and then there's good fruit and bad fruit, and then there's this sobering picture of people standing before Jesus and him saying, Lord, Lord, only to be saying, hey, I never knew you. And at least for me, it wasn't immediately obvious until how all of these pieces fit in together into one message until this week when I was studying it. And as I studied it and I prayed through it, I've come to see that there's a clear flow of what Jesus is saying here, a kind of a inner logic that ties all of this into an urgent call. So let me walk you through the structure, because once we see how it all fits together, the weight of his words become even more clearer for us. So the big theme that we're carrying is stay on the narrow road. Stay on the road that's not crowded, that no one else wants to go on. And he's urging us, again, not to admire his teaching, but to live it out, to shape our lives by the Sermon on the Mount. And he says that's the road that will lead you to life. But here in verse 15, he gives a sobering warning that even if you set your path on the narrow way, there'll be voices along the journey, false prophets, who will try to pull you off course. And that's the heart of the exhortation of Jesus here. He says, be discerning. Because not everyone who looks like a guide is truly going to lead you toward life. And that's the first thing he tells us, that looks can be deceiving. And of course, that raises a natural question. If these false prophets sound the part and look the part and they sound convincing and even look like they belong, how do you tell the difference? How do you know if someone is trustworthy or someone is false? And Jesus answers that question in verses 16 to 20 when he says, by their fruit you'll recognize them. He says the way that you know is fruit. That's the test. Over time, the reality of someone's life will reveal itself with the kind of fruit that they bear. And that's what Jesus covers in the second section, that he says, fruit never lies. And then another question emerges that says, what fruit is Jesus talking about? What are we supposed to be looking for? And that's where verses 21 to 23 come in. Because the true fruit that Jesus is saying matters is not about the flashy performances. It's not the display of power. It's not charisma. It's not outward success. It's not about how impressive someone looks or how dramatic their ministry is or how many people follow them. He says the fruit is far simpler. It's actually far harder. It's the quiet, consistent, everyday obedience of someone who actually does the will of the Father. He says, that's the fruit that I care about. That's the fruit of genuine discipleship. And that's what we'll look at in the third section, that faith actually walks, not just talks. So let's look at this first section. Looks can be deceiving. Look at verse 15. He says, "Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravaging wolves." Notice he begins with this sense of urgency. This be on your guard. He's not saying, hey, when it comes to mind, think about this, or be mildly aware, or keep this in the back of your mind. No, Jesus says, this is serious. As you walk the narrow way, there will be voices that will be calling out to you, vying for your attention, claiming to know the way and say, this is the gate, this is the path, this is where you should go. I'll show you what to do. And the problem, Jesus says, is that not all of those voices can be trusted. Let me ask you, what voices are shaping your walk with God? Who do you allow to guide you, to feed your soul, to influence your vision of the good life? Because the truth is, there is no shortage in our day and time of self-appointed guides, teachers, leaders, influencers. They sound convincing. They can put on a great Instagram reel, who look the part, but they're leading people toward destruction. And here's what's jarring about Jesus' words. The most dangerous guides are not the ones who look dangerous. If someone comes up to you with wild eyes and snarling threats and holding a machete in their arms, you're not going to mistake him for a shepherd. Yeah. The real danger is the ones who appear safe. They look gentle, approachable, even godly. They speak the right words, they wear the right clothes, they sit in the right places, but inside, Jesus says, they're wolves. Predators dressed up in sheep's clothing. And this warning sheds new light on the metaphor of the two words, of the two roads. Because when we first hear Jesus talk about the wide road and the narrow road, we might assume that he's contrasting bad people versus good people, the immoral versus the moral. But friends, that's not what he's doing at all. All throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has been drawing a different contrast. He's been saying not the religious versus the irreligious, not the hypocritical between the insincere or the sincere, but not between those who perform religion and those who don't care. But he says, here's where I'm looking. Here's the contrast. Those who put on a show and those who genuinely love me. Do you remember Matthew 6? Jesus didn't contrast people who pray versus people who didn't pray. He contrasted people who prayed for the show and for it to be seen by others versus those who prayed when they prayed in secret. He didn't contrast those who give versus those who didn't give. He contrasted those who gave to the poor because they wanted everyone to see how much they gave versus those who gave because they were in love with God and provided for him. He didn't contrast those who fast versus those who didn't fast. He contrasted those who fasted just so everyone else could admire them versus those who fasted because they wanted to spend time with God. The contrast isn't good versus bad. The contrast is genuine versus counterfeit. And so we get to chapter 7. Jesus is saying something sobering here. The people that most likely will lead you astray aren't pagans out there who reject Jesus outright, but religious leaders who look like they walk the narrow path, and yet they're pulling people away from the narrow path into the wide one. They're leaders, teachers, charismatic personalities, even miracle workers who appear faithful, but in reality they're imposters. And that lands heavy, doesn't it? Because what Jesus is saying is that the greatest threat to discipleship is not out there in the world. It's not secularism or atheism or Marxism or liberalism or whatever else you think is a great threat to Christianity, whatever else you want to blame. Jesus says the greatest danger is right here, within the religious community itself. Distorted religion, spirituality without obedience, Christianity without Christ-likeness, wolves dressed as sheep. Let me pause here and hear this rightly. Jesus is not telling us to be suspicious of everyone. He's not calling us to paranoia or cynicism, but he is calling us to be discerning people. He's not saying don't trust anyone, but he's saying, hey, pay attention to your fruit. Don't simply be swept up by charisma, credentials, or outward appearances. Look deeper. Ask questions. What kind of life does this teaching produce? Does this look like the character of Christ? And if that's true, if Jesus is right that false prophets are just dangerous, that they don't come with obvious warning signs, then the next question is absolutely crucial. How do you recognize them? How do you know the difference between a wolf and a sheep? How do you discern between someone who's trustworthy and someone who's not? And that's where the second point comes in. Fruit never lies. Fruit never lies. Jesus doesn't just say, watch out for false prophets and then leave us in the dark. He actually tells us how to discern them. Verse 16 says, you'll recognize them by their fruit. That's both comforting and it's challenging. Comforting because it gives us a concrete test. Challenging because fruit takes a while to see. Now, this fruit metaphor isn't just a random metaphor that Jesus comes up with. Jesus is drawing from a deep well of the Old Testament. Again and again, the Israelites in the Old Testament struggled with false prophets in their community. They weren't actual doomsayers. They actually were telling the people what they wanted to hear. They would say, you're fine. Everything's great. Don't worry about God. He's not going to judge you. He's not going to punish you. Do whatever you want. And God says through the prophet Jeremiah that he says the word of the Lord of Jeremiah was clear. The prophets are prophesying falsely in my name. I did not send them. And the way you could test a prophet in the Old Testament was simple. Wait and see if what they said comes to pass. The problem was that could take months, maybe years. But Jesus says, hey, I'm going to give you something more immediate. He says you don't have to just simply wait for predictions to play out. You can look at their lives right now. And he says fruit is a test. Grapes don't grow on thorn bushes and figs don't grow on thistles. In other words, what is on the inside is going to be revealed on the outside. Who someone truly is will show up in how they live, how they treat other people, how they respond when things are going rough. It's such a simple image, but friends, it's deeply profound. A tree can only produce what the root supplies. A healthy tree connected to life will bear good fruit. But a diseased or a cut-off tree might look great for a moment, but it cannot produce life. And Jesus is saying, don't be fooled by polish. Don't be fooled by talent. Don't be fooled by charisma. Look for the fruit that comes from the deep roots of abiding in Jesus. Think about it this way. There are some leaders, they're like Christmas trees. You can hang dazzling ornaments on them. You can wrap them up in lights. You can make them look spectacular and you want to take a picture with them. But no matter how good they look, the reality is that tree is still dead. It's dead. It's cut off from its roots. Eventually the needles fall, the branches dry, and the truth is revealed. But Jesus says a fruit-bearing tree, on the other hand, may not be flashy. It may not be something that you want to take a picture with, but it is alive, it is rooted, it is nourished, and over time it is going to produce what is good. So don't be dazzled by ornaments. Look for fruit. And notice the kind of fruit that Jesus is talking about. He doesn't point us first to someone's words or theology or doctrinal statements. Those matter, but they can be faked. He points us to character, to lived out obedience. Fruit is seen in behavior. It's seen whether someone embodies the ways of Jesus or not. Things like humility, integrity, mercy, purity, love for their enemies, trust in the Father, compassion, and kindness. Let's be honest, words are cheap. Anyone can say, I love Jesus. Anyone can string together some impressive theological phrases. Anyone can attend a church or lead a Bible study or post Christian content online. But the question that Jesus presses into here is, what does their life look like when no one is watching? What fruit is growing from their choices, their relationships, their daily rhythms? Reminded of the story of the police officer who pulls over a car that's plastered with Christian bumper stickers. It's, my boss is a Christian Jewish carpenter, or honk if you love Jesus, and not perfect but forgiven. And you know the type. You've seen those bumper stickers. And when the driver asked, hey, was I speeding? What did I do wrong? And the officer was like, no, I just saw you honk at that elderly lady because she was going too slow across the street. And I saw you flip the car that passed you by, and I saw you scream obscenities at the stoplight. And given all of your bumper stickers, I just assumed that this car was stolen. Right? Words and labels, even religious ones, aren't enough. Fruit is what matters. Jesus says, don't measure by the volume of confession, by flash, or even by knowledge. Measure by fruit. That's where the truth comes out. So let me ask you, what fruit are you looking for in the lives of the people that you follow? What fruit is growing in your own life? Are you evaluating people because of their following or the creativity that they have in producing, or are you following people because of the slow, steady evidence of Christ-like character in their lives? Because Jesus is clear, it's not words, but the fruit that will tell the truth eventually about a person. Here's a third point. Faith walks, not just talks. Now Jesus brings all of this to a sobering truth. He says in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. Notice carefully. Friends, true discipleship is not about the words on our lips, but it's about the obedience of our lives. The mark of a true disciple is not dramatic displays of power, but the steady, faithful demonstration of doing the will of the Father day after day after day for the long haul. And that raises an important question. What is real fruit? What should you be looking for as you seek to discern the genuine from the counterfeit? And Jesus answers with clarity. True fruit is not sensational, but the simple. Not charisma, but character. Not public fireworks, but quiet faithfulness. And the picture that he paints in verse 21 to 23 is chilling. He describes the final day, the judgment day, when all humanity will stand from him. And by the way, don't miss the audacity of Jesus in this text. Sometimes people say that Sermon on the Mount is just a great teaching by a wise guy, but not someone who is divine. But listen, he places himself as the judge of all history, the one who will sort out the eternal destiny of every human being. That is why this claim is not of a mere moral instructor. This is the claim of the Lord of heaven and earth. And on that day, he says, many will come to him, not a few, but many. And they will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? Did we not do miracles in your name? Friends, these are not pagans. These are not secular skeptics. These are religious insiders. These are people who know orthodox doctrine. Notice they call him Lord, which is the Greek word kurios, the very word the church would use in the early creeds, that Jesus is Lord. Their theology was sound. Not only that, they were emotionally engaged. In Hebrew culture, if someone said, Lord, Lord, that was a way of showing deep affection and passion. These were people who worshiped fervently, who lifted their hands in song, who shouted amen with conviction. They weren't cold or detached. They were on fire, outwardly speaking. And beyond all that, they were spectacularly active in ministry. They performed miracles. They cast out demons. They prophesied. They had the kind of ministries that drew crowds. They went viral. They planted churches. They filled stadiums. lives. Their resumes were impressive. By outward measures, they were successful. And yet, what does Jesus say? The most terrifying words in all of Scripture. I never knew you. I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. Do you hear that? They had doctrine. They had passion. They had ministry results. But what they lacked was relationship. What they lacked was obedience. I never knew you. And friends, this is where we need to pause. Because the point is not to terrify us into paralysis. Jesus is not trying to make his disciples second guess their salvation. The point is about discernment. The point is to show us what kind of fruit truly matters to God. And the fruit that he's after is not sensational power or a show, but it's simple obedience. Think back over the Sermon on the Mount. Did Jesus ever command us to perform miracles? Did he ever say, blessed are those who cast out demons? Did he say, blessed are those who heal the sick? He didn't. What did he teach? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. He told us to love our enemies, to forgive as we have been forgiven, to give generously without a show, to pray in secret, to let our yes be yes and our no's be no. In short, the life and the fruit that Jesus is looking for in your life and my life is just a life of simple obedience that flows out of a love for God. So here, this true fruit is not showy spirituality that draws the applause. True fruit is daily faithfulness that reflects Jesus. More than casting out demons, he's interested that we cast out our anger and our resentment. More than healing others, he calls us to heal us of our pride and our lust. More than prophesying impressive words, he calls us to speak simply, truthfully, graciously. The true fruit is ordinary obedience, living the way of the kingdom when nobody is watching except your Father in heaven. Friends, that means there's a categorical difference between what someone does on a platform and what someone does in private. There's a difference between me preaching right now and the way that I treat my wife and my kids and my neighbor tomorrow. The question is not how gifted you are, but the question is, how loving are you? How much do you model Jesus in this world? Because the fulfillment of the law, Jesus says, is not what we do, but it's love. Love for God, love for neighbor. That's true fruit. Trevor Hudson is a pastor in the UK, and he tells a story that captures this absolutely beautifully. In his church, there was a woman whose husband was tragically killed in a street accident, and she was devastated, sitting in shock on the floor of her apartment for days. And one of her children's teachers heard what happened, and she came to the apartment, sat next to this grieving widow, and without saying a word, just put her cheek against her cheek and wept with her for a long time. And she stayed there for a very long time, just holding her hand and weeping with her. And before she left, she quietly placed an envelope of money on the table to help the family with their needs, and that was it. No speech, no fanfare, just presence, compassion, and love. And Trevor Hudson says, that was the embrace of God. And he's right. That's the fruit that Jesus is talking about. Not gifts, but love. Not spectacles, but service. Not honor for ourselves, but mercy for others. And the day of judgment, Jesus is not going to ask us how many conferences did we speak at, how many miracles we performed, how many followers we had, how often we showed up to church, how much money we gave. He'll ask us whether our cheek touched the cheeks of those who mourn, whether our hands held the hands of those who are broken, whether our lives bore the fruit of love for those who are hurting. Friends, that's the fruit that Jesus is after in our lives. So how do we apply this? How do we take a text that is as weighty and unsettling as this one and apply this to our lives? Because I don't believe Jesus gave us these words to paralyze us with fear, but he gave them to us to form us into discerning disciples of Jesus. And he wants us to walk the narrow way with eyes wide open, able to recognize the difference between what is genuine and what is counterfeit. So let me give you two things. Number one, discernment about others. The first application is discernment about others. The thrust of this text is clear. Be careful who you follow. Not everyone who claims to follow God, not everyone who writes books, hosts podcasts, fills stadiums in Jesus' names is actually leading people toward Jesus. Some are wolves dressed as sheep. But let me also say this, because this is where Christians go off rails. There's a whole tribe of Christians out there who have become experts at wolf hunting and wolf spotting. You know the type. They sit on their YouTube with their webcam and a bookshelf in their background, running entire channels devoted to exposing wolves in the church. They can sniff out a wolf faster than TSA can find water in your backpack. And here's the problem. Their definition of what a wolf is just means anyone who disagrees with them. Sometimes someone phrases something differently, that's a wolf. Someone lands in a different spot on a secondary issue, that's a wolf. Someone doesn't wear a suit when they preach, that's a wolf. Someone has pride of their nation, that's a wolf. Someone hates our president, that's a wolf. Meanwhile, the real wolves are sitting back laughing because the sheep are too busy biting themselves. Now listen, spotting wolves and calling out wolves is not the job that Jesus gave to you and me. Who is the judge in this text? It's not us. It's Jesus. He alone will sort it out on that last day. Our calling is not to run around the kingdom with a whistle and a whiteboard handing out wolf citations. Friends, that's not discernment. That's arrogance dressed up as holiness. And what Jesus is calling of us is something that's far harder, far slower, and far less flashy. Be people who look for fruit and be people who are producing fruit in your own life. And that is especially important in our cultural moment in our day. 100 years ago, most Christians only had to discern one voice, their local pastor, the person they heard week after week after week in their own church. But today, we're flooded with voices at our fingertips. You can hear any sermon you want from any pastor in the world on YouTube. You can listen to podcasts. You can watch Instagram reels. You can read best-selling authors. You can look at TikTok theologians. You can watch celebrity pastors. The marketplace for spiritual voices has never been more crowded. So who do you follow? Who do you trust to shape your imagination of the Christian life? Jesus says, look for fruit. Not flash, but fruit. Character. Christ-likeness. Do they embody the Beatitudes? Do they sound like the Sermon on the Mount? Are they meek? Are they merciful? Are they pure in heart? Do they love their enemies? Do they speak truthfully? Are they faithful in their marriage? Are they generous to the poor? Do they care for the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, the refugee? Do they honor the image of God in every human being? Or do they hunger and thirst not for righteousness, but simply for power? These are the questions that you must ask of anyone who presumes to lead in Jesus' name. And can I say, that includes me. No pastor, no teacher, no leader is above that test. And I want you to hear me clearly on this. I want to invite you into that same scrutiny in my own life as your pastor. If I dare stand up here week after week and open God's word before you, if I presume to speak on behalf of Jesus, then you have every right to look at my life and say, does his life bear the fruit of Christ-likeness? That's not cynicism, that's obedience. Jesus has called you to discernment, and discernment doesn't mean that you nitpick your leader. So don't nitpick me, waiting for me to stumble. It doesn't mean you put them under a microscope hoping to catch them in failure. But it means that you look for the evidence of the Spirit showing up in their life. Humility, mercy, truthfulness, purity, generosity, love. It means that if the Beatitudes and the fruits of the Spirit are not showing up in my life as I lead you, you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't. And I'll be honest, this is sobering even for me, because it reminds me that ministry is not about performance or trying to fill this room up, not about the size of the church or the eloquence of the sermon, but it's about the kind of person that I am becoming when no one is watching. Because that's the standard that Jesus cares about. And I need you as the body of Christ to help me stay faithful to that call. So don't ever be afraid to pray for me, to encourage me, even to challenge me if you see blind spots in my life. That's not disloyalty, that's love. And that's what it means to be the church walking together in the narrow way. We are called to test fruit, to strengthen one another, and to keep pointing each other back to Jesus. Here's the second thing, discernment about yourself. The second application, maybe the most important, is discernment about yourself. Because the passage is not aimed at celebrity pastors or religious leaders out there. The passage is for every single one of us. Jesus is calling you and I to hold up a mirror. And so here's the question. If your life was if you're in this past week, if your life was on trial, not your beliefs, not your church attendance, not the verses you could recite, but the actual fruit of your life, what evidence would there be? Would anyone be able to point to proof of Christ-likeness in your life? Would there be signs of humility and grace and mercy and faithfulness and love? Or would there be evidence of something else? And notice where Jesus places the emphasis on verse 23. He doesn't say, you never knew me. He says, I never knew you. That's chilling, isn't it? These are people who say they knew all about Jesus. They could say the right things. They did ministry in his name. They never opened their lives to Jesus in relationship to Jesus. They never let him in. It makes me think about my own life. I was looking at Facebook the other day and realized I've got some 3,500 Facebook friends. And that number always makes me laugh because the truth is I don't know 3,500 people. I might have spoken at a conference or did a church planting event and someone clicked add friend because they wanted to be friends with me and follow me. Maybe I coached them, or maybe we met in briefing and they see my posts and they know of me. But if we're honest, I probably know a dozen of them really, really well. The rest know my name, they know what I do, but they don't know me. Now contrast that with my marriage. Anna suffered with me as of yesterday for 22 years, right? You're welcome. She knows me. She knows my quirks. She knows my habits. She knows the areas where I'm strong. She knows the areas where I'm weak. She knows the foods that I like. She knows the way I think through my decisions. She knows the way I breathe when I'm stressed. She knows when to leave me alone because I'm annoyed. And she knows how loud I snore at night. She knows the best and the worst of me. And after 22 years, she doesn't just know facts about me, she actually knows me. And that's the difference that Jesus is getting here. There are thousands and thousands of people who say they know of Jesus. They can list facts about him. They can quote his teaching. They can even do works in his name, but it's not the same as being in a living, ongoing, transforming relationship with Jesus. The difference between knowing about and being known is the difference between spiritual death and spiritual life, friends. And this is where discernment about yourself becomes vital. Do you just know about Jesus? Do you just talk about him, sing about him, post about him? Or do you really know him? Have you opened up the deepest, messiest parts of your life to him? The sin, the shame, the hidden fears, the stubborn corners of your heart. Have you said, Lord, I don't just want to serve you at a distance, but I want you to live in me, change me, transform me? Because fruit doesn't grow by stapling apples to a dead tree. Fruit grows from the inside out. The main thing that Jesus is looking for is not your religious activity, not your gift, not your resume. The main thing is he wants to see him shine through you. Christ-likeness. And the good news is that kind of fruit always begins where the Sermon on the Mount began. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The true disciple is not one with a shelf full of trophies. The true disciple is the one who knows their need, runs to Jesus in dependence, and lets the Spirit do the slow, daily work of transformation. That's where real fruit comes, knowing him and being known by him. So let me close. Yes, this is a weighty word. And if you feel unsettled by it, that's okay. Jesus didn't mean these words to sober us. Jesus meant for these words to sober us, to wake us up. But hear me. The goal of Jesus is not to shame you or to scare you into faking your obedience. The goal is to invite you into a deeper relationship with Jesus, to be known by him, to walk with him, to let his life flow through you. The fruit that God desires in your life isn't flash fame or flawless performance. He just wants you to be faithful today. And when you wake up tomorrow, he wants you to be faithful tomorrow. It is a life that is rooted in Jesus, open to him, surrendered to him, day by day, becoming more like him. And that happens not because we try harder. It happens because we stay connected to Jesus. Fruit doesn't grow on a tree by straining and sweating. It grows by being rooted in good soil. And so our lives don't produce good fruit by our effort, but it's produced simply by us abiding with Jesus. And friends, this is why the cross is the center of all of this. Because the cross is where Jesus opened himself fully to us, where he bore our sin and our shame, where he gave himself so that we might be reconciled, forgiven, and made new. At the cross, Jesus says, I know you, I see you, I love you. And when you receive that love, not just knowing about him, when you recognize that you are known by him, that's where true fruit begins to grow. And so we come to the table this morning. This is the moment to do exactly what the text says, to invite Jesus in. Whether you have been a believer for 40, 50 years, or you are brand new to this faith and you are exploring, this is where you invite Jesus in and say, Jesus, do I just know about you, or do I know you? Communion, this table is not about showing off our spiritual resumes. It is coming empty-handed, poor in spirit, saying, Lord, I need you. I want to be rooted in you. I want to be known by you. Here at the bread and the cup, we remember that the fruit that we are bearing does not come from ourselves. It comes from a body that was broken and a blood that was poured for us. Here we receive his life into ours. Here we are nourished, forgiven, and renewed. And so as you prepare to come to the table, don't ask, what more I need to do for Jesus. Don't do that. But can I invite you to ask, where do I need to let Jesus in? What is it that I'm holding on to that I've not let go? And can I invite you to let Jesus into those dark, stubborn, hidden places of your soul? Because when you do, the fruit will come. Not magically overnight, but it will come slowly, quietly, beautifully, and friends, eternally. So I want to invite you to come to the table of grace. Come to be known by him. Come to abide in him. Come to receive the life of Jesus. We invite you to examine your heart, your attitudes, your affections. If you need someone to pray with you, our prayer team is there in the back. Go pray with them. And then whenever you're ready, come, grab the elements, go back to your seats, remain standing, We'll take communion together when the worship team is done singing. But examine your heart. Do you know Jesus? Do you know about Jesus? Or do you deeply know Jesus? Let's worship.